In November 2004, a man by the name of Harry Patch arrived in France. At 106 years of age, Mr. Patch, who had fought at the Battle of Passchendaele 87 years earlier, was Britain's oldest surviving veteran of the First World War. He had returned to France for a particular reason. He was going to meet Charles Kuntz. Mr. Kuntz, now Germany's oldest surviving veteran, had fought on the opposite side of the trenches of the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. In an emotional ceremony, the two men shook hands. They had had 87 years to reflect on the nature of war. When asked for his assessment, however, Harry Patch's answer might have come as something of a shock. "To me," Patch declared, "war is a license to go out and murder. Why should the British government call me up and take me out to a battlefield to shoot a man I never knew, whose language I couldn't speak? All those lives lost for a war finished over a table. Now what is the sense in that?" There are few topics in history which generate as much controversy and debate as that of who or what was responsible for the outbreak of the First World War. How could a relatively small-scale conflict occurring in southeastern Europe have culminated in the deaths of over 20 million people and 4.5 years of brutal conflict? In this video, we are going to look at one of the most popular and controversial interpretations of the war's origins: the idea that Europe's leaders sleptwalked into war in 1914. This view, which can be seen as early as the 1920s, was put forward most famously in 2012 by an Australian historian named Christopher Clark. In Clark's view, the war was not the particular fault of any one nation. Unlike other interpretations which place the blame on the aggression of Germany and Austria-Hungary, Clark described the outbreak of the First World War as a tragedy, not a crime. So what did Clark mean by this, and how could a world war begin almost accidentally? To answer these questions, we need to return to the year 1919. No one wants to be considered responsible for starting a war, but for a conflict that had led to the deaths of tens of millions of people, this was especially the case. Unsurprisingly, politicians at the conclusion of the war were desperate to prove the innocence of their own country and the guilt of their opponents. It was in this atmosphere then, in June 1919, that the heads of state of each major power arrived at the Palace of Versailles in France to determine what penalties were to be imposed onto the defeated German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman and Bulgarian empires. In the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies forced their opponents to sign a clause in which they admitted responsibility for the war's outbreak. The so-called War Guilt Clause stated that Germany, Austria-Hungary and their allies were responsible for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments have been subjected. This interpretation, however, did not go unchallenged. It was now the turn of historians to give their own interpretation of who was responsible for the war's outbreak. So what evidence do we have that it was Germany and Austria-Hungary that were at fault? And what is the counter-evidence to this claim? Let's have a quick reminder of how the First World War began, and if you're new to this topic, it might be worth checking out my 10-minute overview of the origins of this conflict. In really simple terms, the immediate cause of the war was a single event. On the 28th of June 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife were assassinated by a young Bosnian Serb by the name of Gavrilo Princip. This event plunged Europe into diplomatic chaos. Austria-Hungary, blaming Serbia for the assassination, invaded Serbia. Russia, who had close ties to Serbia, retaliated by declaring war against Austria-Hungary. This was a serious problem. Since 1907, Europe had been divided into two camps, with Russia, Britain and France on one side and Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy on the other. If any two countries from either side of this alliance system went to war, it was possible and perhaps even probable that all the other countries would have to fight as well. And this is exactly what happened. Within a week of Russia's declaration of war against Austria-Hungary, all the major European powers had joined in, and a small-scale conflict occurring in southeastern Europe had somehow escalated into a world war. Now, since the 1960s, responsibility for the outbreak of this war has typically been placed in the hands of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The basic accusation levelled at these countries is that their leaders had exploited the crisis in Sarajevo to deliberately provoke a European war. A war, moreover, which they had been planning and preparing for many years. Austria-Hungary's invasion of Serbia was, after all, supported by the German leadership, and it was well understood that this would antagonise Russia. At the very least, it appears that the leaders of Germany and Austria-Hungary were willing to risk a large-scale war in order to achieve their diplomatic aims. What then is the alternative interpretation of these events? In 2012, an Australian historian by the name of Christopher Clark published a book entitled The Sleepwalkers: How Europe Went to War in 1914. The book was incredibly popular, particularly in Germany, but also quite controversial. Germany, already struggling from guilt for their responsibility in the Second World War, was also being considered responsible for the First. Clark's book, however, largely absolved Germany from this responsibility. So what did Clark argue, and what evidence did he give to support it? The central metaphor of Clark's book is that of a sleepwalker. When we think of a sleepwalker, we think of someone whose actions are largely unconscious, as well as being unpredictable. In Clark's view, Europe's leaders sleptwalked into war in 1914. Far from deliberately seeking a massive European conflict, the leaders of Germany and Austria-Hungary, but also Russia, France, Britain and Italy, were largely unaware of the consequences of their actions in the months leading up to the outbreak of war in 1914. Whatever you think of the overall plausibility of Clark's argument, it's clear that he provided lots of evidence to support his thesis. In a very brief and slightly oversimplified manner, here are the 3 key arguments of Clark's work. The first key thing to point out here is that the war did not come out of nowhere. On the contrary, tension between the 6 major countries, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia and Italy, had been rising steadily for decades. 3 key factors had increased this tension: militarism, imperialism and nationalism. Since the 1870s, several European states had begun to increase the size, scale and power of their armies. All 6 major European powers greatly increased the amount of money they spent on their military forces. Britain and Germany, meanwhile, were also engaged in a struggle to see who could build a bigger and more powerful navy. A second factor increasing tension at this time was the issue of imperialism. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed the violent conquest of many parts of the world. Britain, by the late 19th century, had created a vast empire that contained 23% of the world's population by 1913. As each European power wrestled for control over these new territories, many came close to fighting one another. What made these imperial disputes even more worrying was the issue of nationalism. In particular, the incredibly dangerous belief, increasingly common among key decision makers across Europe, that war was inevitable. The 1800s was the century of the nation state, and one of the key beliefs that attached itself to the nation was the idea that national sovereignty, power or control of one's own country, could only be guaranteed through military victory. Crucially, Clark points out that these beliefs were not unique to Germany or Austria-Hungary, but were common throughout Europe. As each European power built up their military force, they began to sense the danger of becoming isolated. In 1882, Germany had allied with Austria-Hungary and Italy to form a triple alliance, and in 1907 a triple entente was formed, containing Russia, Britain and France. Now Europe was divided into 2 camps, and this dramatically increased the possibility that a small-scale conflict could lead to a much larger one involving all of the major powers. Although Austria-Hungary and Germany might have been the first to form a military alliance, in the overall build-up of this dangerous system, all 6 European powers clearly shared some responsibility. The third and final part of Clark's argument, and arguably the one for which he's received the greatest criticism, is that in the months leading up to war, Europe's leaders were largely unaware of the consequences of their actions. Even key decision makers typically considered to be aggressive, such as the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, are instead characterised as being extremely reluctant to provoke a major European war. When we look back at historical events, because we know that they happened, it is all too easy to assume that they were always going to happen, that they were inevitable. Clark, however, emphasises that no one in the governments in Europe could predict with any certainty how other countries would react, and crucially, this makes Austria-Hungary's invasion of Serbia look less like a deliberate attempt to provoke war, and more like an opportunistic gamble. So Clark characterises the outbreak of the First World War as an accident rather than a crime. By looking at the gradual build-up in tensions of Europe from 1870 onwards, the crisis that emerged in the summer of 1914 looks less like the result of deliberate German and Austro-Hungarian aggression than a confusing, uncertain diplomatic nightmare that every major European power had some part to play in. Clarke's thesis then spreads responsibility for the war's outbreak across all the major European countries. Shockingly, this leads to the conclusion that the greatest war the world had yet to see, and the death of 20 million people, began as some sort of tragic accident. Perhaps it was true, as Britain's wartime Prime Minister David Lloyd George had put it, that Europe had slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war in 1914. Thanks for watching this video, hopefully you enjoyed it. What do you make of Clarke's characterisation? Is it persuasive? If you agree or disagree with it, or my characterisation of Clarke's position, I'd love to hear in the comment section. If you liked the video, and you want to hear more about other interpretations of the First World War, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks, and see you next time.